introduce in just a moment. So how are we doing? Has anybody seen what the attendees number has been doing?
It's been holding steady.
Holding steady.
You could probably start.
Okay. Well, then let me do that. So I want to say welcome to Alex Reeves. Alex is a Greenhills alumnus of the class of 2015 and an older brother of Libby Reeves, who is 2017. And some of you may remember Alex, and some of you may remember Libby, and some of you may know neither of them. So I'm glad you're getting a chance to meet Alex today. During Alex's industrious and illustrious Greenhills years, he was deeply interested in the STEM disciplines, taking most of the science and math classes offered at Greenhills, and of course, taking a number of other things as well. He was a member of the NOSB and a founding member of the upper school's NSB teams. And the NSB team, he was competed in the national competition, both his junior and senior years, the first years that we competed. Before graduating from Greenhills, Alex demonstrated his interest in space, astronomy, and space exploration. He won the 2015 Ames Space Settlement Design Contest with the Freyr Project, the 247-page detailed design of a space colony for 20,000 people. This was a substantial project. It so overwhelmed the Ames Space Settlement Design Contest that they created the Reeves limit, and they wouldn't allow anybody to produce a project quite this long. And I'm not sure what the Reeves limit is, but maybe we'll learn about that later. Alex continued to show his interest in space at CalTech, where he won the CalTech Space Challenge in 2017, and where he earned a bachelor's in science with degrees in both astrophysics and mechanical engineering in June of 2020. Since graduating, he's been working at SpaceX. Welcome back to Greenhills, Alex.
Thank you, Mr. Rossi. Right off the bat, I guess I've never heard my time at Greenhills called illustrious before, so that's certainly new. But thank you for the introduction. I'm going to start sharing my screen, put together a few slides here. And the other thing I want to say quickly is if you have any questions, please submit them throughout. You don't have to wait until the end. Be happy to answer them. And so I guess under the Q&A tab, and then Yusuf and Sabine will read them out. So feel free to submit questions at any time. Before I really get going, let me see. Okay. Still figuring out how to use Zoom again. It's been a while. This is something that came out this week. It's the parachute from the Perseverance Mars Rover mission that landed on Mars this past Thursday. But the video was released on Monday, and you can see it's got these interesting patterns on it. And the parachute has these patterns, these different markings, so you can look up at it and you can tell what the geometry of the parachute is as it unfolds. So these big red markings here are really optical targets. But these other markings in here look kind of weird. You know, there's some sort of order, but it's not clear what it is maybe. So what I'm offering here is throughout my presentation, if you want to think about what this could be, maybe suggest some things, I think that would be kind of fun. I can tell you there is a hidden message in the parachute design. With that though, another word of warning, I'll continue to talk about things until we're all out of time. So let me know if I'm rambling too long on any particular subject. A little bit of background about myself. As Mr. Rossi mentioned, I'm a Greenhills alum, class of 2015, CalTech alum, class of 2020, and I'm currently working at SpaceX as a GNC engineer. So it's guidance, navigation, and control. In my free time, I like to go out and rock climb and canyoneer, which is much more of a sport out here in California than it is in Michigan. But so that anyway, that's what I do in my free time, and I'm an Eagle Scout for any of you who may be involved in the scouting program as well. I came to Greenhills in 2009 in the 7th grade and then graduated 2015 after the 12th grade. I was looking back trying to find some pictures from then, and this was one of the better ones I found. It's from almost exactly 6 years ago. We've got Mr. Zellers here on Fancy Friday, and then members of class of 2015, and I look really, really young in that picture, but I guess it was several years ago. I was on the forensics team, Science Bowl and Ocean Bowl, participated in the Mars rover design challenge that U of M hosts or used to host. I'm not sure if it's still active. I swam, was on the cross country and track teams, and then the two that I put last because I just barely remembered them as I was editing are the math team and the advanced research class, which I sort of consider as a summer internship more than a extracurricular. The other reason I chose this picture is because it's one of the things that I remember best about Greenhills. This is the 12th grade forum. I'm not sure if it's changed since I was there, but one of the distinct memories I have is just gathering together in that forum, whether it was Fancy Friday or just hanging around lockers with my friends. So I guess that's one of the things that it's one of the things I'm going to come back to is I don't necessarily remember a whole lot of individual details aside from the people who were there with me. A couple of the pictures from my time at Greenhills. This is the cross-country team, and then this is the National Science Bowl team right after winning the regional in 2014. And I picked this partly because it's just such an awkward-looking picture. You know, we've got the banner up, and everyone looks sort of forced. But this was another one of those memories, just because it was such a fun day and such a nice validation of the work that we've been doing. After Greenhills, after I graduated in 2015, I went on to CalTech, where I was a member of Blacker House. We're not a cult. We're definitely just wearing all the shirts for some unrelated reason. Again, some of the things that I remember best are the people I was there with. I was not a perfect student at CalTech, despite however illustrious Mr. Rossi may say my Greenhills career was. Graduated after 5 years, where typically you take 4. I changed my major 4 times. Initially studying astrophysics, and then just physics, and then just mechanical engineering, and then anyway. So the other thing that I've sort of taken away from both Greenhills and CalTech was you don't have to know what you're doing all the time. You can just do what you're interested in, and typically it'll work out okay. This was a much more typical state than the previous. I did a lot of interesting hands-on work at CalTech. So one of the things I'd be happy to talk about is some of the robotics classes and some of the engineering classes. These pictures are from a class where we designed aquatic robots to score these little Woboba balls into a goal. So it's a lot of fun. We got to actually spend a lot of hands-on time in the machine shop and a lot of very practical mechanical design. I also did a lot of very theoretical work that I'd be happy to talk about. Some of these are from a structures class. There's a continuum mechanics class for some of them. One of these is on voting theory over here. And then this was for a physics class where we're looking at dynamics. And again, I'm happy to talk to all of these in more detail if you have questions or if you have anything you want to ask about them. But otherwise, I wasn't going to focus too much on the coursework. And then before I get to the space things, just want to go over some of the most important things that I've learned both at Greenhills. Greenhills helped teach a lot of these things, and then also at CalTech. So asking the right questions. If all you have is an answer and you don't know why you're asking it, that's just as useless as having a question you don't know the answer to. So if you don't know why you're doing what you're doing, then you'll never have something useful to build on. Along the same lines, if you find yourself unexcited about what you're doing, consider doing something else. Part of the reason why I switched away from physics was I realized that I was solving lots of equations and I wasn't really excited about what they meant. Particle physics is cool, but it's not my thing. And when I realized that, it was sort of a, well, okay, what should I do instead? And then engineering and astrophysics were the things that excited me. Because the astrophysics was, you have these equations and you can apply them to things and you can observe those things, you know, through telescopes, through radio astronomy, through LIGO. And that was really, really interesting. And then with the engineering, it's the same sort of, you know, you can derive these equations, you can derive relations between them, and then you can look around, you can see, point to this thing and say, that's an application of what I learned. That's an application of what I learned, which is really appealing to me. On the other hand, I had some friends who were very, very talented physicists who enjoyed it just because of the pure mathematical beauty of it. So whatever you're excited about, I would go in that direction. The third one was building networks of people. I really struggled at CalTech with some of the coursework, and I would not have graduated or passed a lot of my classes if I hadn't found people to work with. Sometimes I was the one finding the solution to a problem, sometimes someone else was. Sometimes it took several of us together finding pieces of it to put everything together and develop the understanding. But the bottom line for me was I could not have done it alone, and the people I worked with couldn't have done it without me. So that's been huge. It's just recognizing that no one is good enough, or it's not even good enough. Nobody has to or really should be doing everything on their own. Opportunities to work with other people let you consider their perspectives and let everyone build their knowledge together. And then finally, just a little bit cheeky, using energy methods wherever you can. This was one of the biggest things that, one of the biggest changes going into CalTech was I took a chemistry class, Chem 1, all the freshmen take it. And we got into inorganic chemistry mostly in the first term, and then organic chemistry in the second. And the professor on the first day puts up the Schrodinger equation, which for anyone who's not familiar is an equation that describes how waves interact that's applicable to chemistry through quantum mechanics and the bond energies and bond lengths within molecules. And the professor says, you don't need to understand how to solve this equation, but you need to understand how the solutions work with each other. And then we talked about orbitals, and orbitals, you know, you'll learn in 10th grade chemistry, I guess for anyone who hasn't taken it yet. Is it still 10th grade?
Yes.
Yes.
Still 10th, okay, perfect. You'll learn in 10th grade chemistry that bonds are formed between atoms and that they have these electron shells. So you get the S, P, D, F, and et cetera shells. And you'll learn that electrons inhabit these shells, and you'll learn, at least in some of the courses, that they have spin up and spin down, and they stack outward into the shells. But you won't learn what the shells really are. And partly because it's a really complicated thing to describe what the shells really are. But one of the biggest changes for me was starting to think about everything in terms of energy. So bond length being an energy minimization between a separated state and a bonded state. Thinking about reactions as happening on an energy surface. You know, you look at reaction mechanisms, and there's an activation energy, and then my camera is backwards for me. Okay, there's an activation energy, and then the products are lower energy than the reactants for some descriptions of enthalpy. Thinking about organic reactions, you have this huge many-dimensional surface, and teaching yourself to think in terms of energy isosurfaces and pathways along those surfaces, I think is really valuable. So everything else is sort of lessons that I learned. And then the last one is advice for anybody going into STEM. So the reason Mr. Rossi initially reached out to me is because I work at SpaceX now, and I did this Freyr project for the Space Settlement Design competition. So that was from fall of my senior year to spring. And the settlement design competition says effectively just design a settlement in space. It's not on a planet, it's just orbiting in space, and it has to be sustainable. So that was the prompt basically. And then they have some information about sources to check out and some of the resources that they had available to use. But everything else was pretty freeform. So that was one of my first experiences with starting to look at a problem and try to figure out what the right questions to ask were. And then after that, trying to figure out the answers. So, you know, you start with the idea that you need this settlement in free space. Okay, well, for humans to live long-term in space, you probably need gravity. So we got to figure out how to do gravity. And you also need some life support systems. You got to figure out how to do that. And you need to be able to communicate. And all these different things, these system requirements will boil down to questions of how can you best integrate those together? Can you kill two birds with one stone and design something that solves multiple problems? In retrospect, you know, looking back at this paper, Mr. Rossi mentioned it's 247 pages. About 100 of those were probably filler. They didn't need to be in there, which is something that I just didn't realize when I was writing it. It's very easy to get caught up in answering more and more questions without asking yourself whether they're important questions. So I would answer one, and then I'd think of another one, and I'd go answer that, and I'd think of another one, and I'd go answer that. And again, hindsight is 20/20, right? Retrospect, but it ended up being too long and too full of information that wasn't really necessary. I did win the competition that year. I know that they did impose a page limit. I don't know what it is, and I suspect they don't call it the Reeves limit, but they did institute a page limit because I talked to one of the judges at the conference that year, and he said, yeah, we didn't want to read half a dozen entries that are this long next year. But that's an aside. As a result of winning this, I got to go to the International Space Development Conference, which was in Toronto that year. If it's ever near Detroit again in the near future, I'd highly recommend going. It's a really cool conference that brings together mostly space entrepreneurs, but also Buzz Aldrin was there, Kip Thorne was there. If you know the movie Interstellar, he was a scientific advisor for that, and then he won the Nobel Prize in 2018, I think. I hope I'm not getting the year wrong. Might be 2017. So that was a really, really cool experience. If you have any interest in space, I'd recommend looking at the competition and maybe submitting something of your own for the 2020. Well, there's still time for 2021 maybe, but definitely for 2022. It was a really valuable experience for me. And even though I can look back now and say that I made a lot of mistakes writing it, it was really, really valuable for me because I did learn a lot while researching it. And I did have the opportunity to do a lot of interesting analysis and sort of mostly technical work, trying to figure out what the design should be. Hang on a sec. I'm again having trouble with Zoom. There we go. Okay. And then the second thing that Mr. Rossi mentioned was the CalTech Space Challenge, which was in 2017. And the challenge for 2017 was design a lunar base that could refuel missions to Mars. So it would provide fuel to missions that were still in the Earth's orbit, and then it would refuel them on the way to Mars. The CalTech Space Challenge selects 2 teams of 16 so 32 total. And so one thing I think it's important to say is while my team did win, it wasn't an individual effort. So like before, what I mentioned, we had 16 people working for a week, putting huge amounts of time and thought and effort into various aspects of this project. I was off working on the orbit design and the trajectory performance, which is funny enough, exactly what I do now for my job. But we had other people looking at surface utilization. We had other people looking at how we were going to power this thing. We had people looking at the economic case and how we could best market it. So it really takes a lot of people with different perspectives to come together and answer questions like this. I tried to do it on my own with the settlement competition. It was good enough for that, but looking back, not spectacular. And I think we did a much better job on the CalTech Space Challenge just because we had so many different people. Among the 16 people we had there, we had a few undergrads, mostly grad students. One person from RISD, Rhode Island School of Design, who was doing visualization work. We had several economists and MBAs who were there, who were working on how to best propose the project, how to best, what the best value proposition we could provide was, how to manage the funding. So, it's easy to say, well, we'll do this and this and that, but if you don't manage your cash flow properly, you'll wind up running out of money partway through. So this is a really interesting challenge that I'd be happy to talk more about if you have questions. But the real upshot of the experience there was bringing people together from across the board really, really helped in terms of getting a high quality proposal and making sure that we didn't have any blind spots in terms of things that weren't addressed that should have been. So these were the two sort of big projects that I worked on that are maybe relevant to what I do now. Yeah, so this is just a quick summary of the things that went wrong with the Freyr project. So it was over technical. I had way too much technical detail. It was over optimistic, which the timeline was super compressed from what it would actually be. It was the funding expectation that I had, or the projection that I had, was way too optimistic. In terms of technology, I was very, very dismissive in retrospect of things that had to be developed and brought to maturity before they could really be used in industrial setting. And then understood. So this is something that's funny to me now. Is I put this picture in there. I said it was a locking rappel device, and now having spent a few years learning how to climb and learning how to actually use all these devices, this is not a locking device, not even remotely. So it's funny to me now to go back and look at all these things that I was so certain of at the time and realize that, in actuality, I did not know what I was talking about. I suspect it'll also be funny to look back in a few years at what I'm doing now, or what I did in my last year at CalTech, and realize that I didn't know what I was talking about and that I was really not seeing the full picture. As Mr. Rossi mentioned, I graduated from CalTech in June of 2020, and I immediately, I took about 2 weeks off, and then I went to work at SpaceX as a GNC engineer. GNC stands for Guidance, Navigation, and Control, and what that means mostly is I design trajectories. So you see pictures like this after the rocket launches, and the rocket's streaking off into the distance, and it's curving over. So one of the big things that I do, working on the Falcon program specifically, is I design that trajectory and that curve to optimize it for the mission. I had some experience with GNC. I took a few classes at CalTech in spacecraft control and maneuvering, and I had a pretty solid handle on orbital mechanics. But one of the things that I'm just continually learning here is there's so much more detail than I had understood before. I can't really talk about what all those details are, but I can point in some general directions. So I was aware that gravity turns are a thing, for example. If any of you play Kerbal Space Program, you know this. You start going up, and then partway through you tip over, and by the time you reach orbit, you're trying to go sideways. I didn't know all the constraints that went into designing what that turn should look like. So Kerbal Space Program, for example, doesn't model aerodynamic effects, and it sort of models gravity drag correctly, but not really. Things like aerothermal heating become super important when you're talking about when you can actually do certain things along your trajectory. So this has been both incredibly challenging and incredibly educational. You know, I thought I would be prepared going into it with a degree in astrophysics from CalTech. Turns out there's a lot of incredibly specific knowledge that well, it's been almost 8 months now, and I'm still digging into it and learning more every single day about what I do and how the rocket's controlled. So this has been incredible. I unfortunately can't talk about too much more of it. There's a lot of confidential stuff. There's a lot of ITAR, international traffic in arms regulation stuff that I don't want to get on the wrong side of. They get really serious about potentially transmitting effectively guided missile technology outside of controlled spaces. So I can answer some general questions about SpaceX, and I can answer some general questions about what I do, but it's not something that I can go into much detail on. Unfortunately, I would love to, but unfortunately, I can't do that. So with that, that's about everything that I had prepared to talk about. More of an overview than anything else, and I wanted to see what you guys had for questions, see if I can answer anything, or just have a discussion about anything you want to ask me about, really. And then I just put this back up because I think it's a really fun little problem. So I'll leave this up unless we want to go back to any particular slide, but otherwise you guys can look at this and try to decipher it. So with that, if we have any questions, I'd be happy to answer those or go back over anything. It's kind of whatever you guys want from here on out.
Yeah, thank you very much, Alex. That was a very, it was a great presentation, very informative. So yeah, I think please feel free to ask any questions that you have in the Q&A section. We sent out a survey a couple of days ago, and I'm going to try to read out some of the questions we got from that survey. So I'll start off with this one question we received from a student named Harper. And he's asking, I think you touched on this a bit already, but what advice would you give to current students who aspire to work for SpaceX or in the STEM fields?
Yeah, so for sure, if you have an opportunity to take any of the advanced chemistry, calculus-based physics, all those kinds of things, definitely take those opportunities. And if you have anything you're interested in outside of class, you know, if you're interested in learning about additional topics in physics, anything like that, I know Mr. Aussie, Dr. Lupton were very helpful in providing me more resources to learn about things. So definitely go ask your teachers. They know more than they're teaching you, and I'm sure they'd be happy to help get you some of that knowledge. Aside from that, one of the things that I learned sort of while I was at CalTech, it doesn't really matter what college you go to, as long as you're going there to learn and you're focusing on developing the knowledge. CalTech was great. I'm working with a bunch of people now who went to schools that you might not recognize, who are every bit as smart as people I met at CalTech. It doesn't matter which particular school you go to, and focusing on any particular thing might help you miss something that's a better fit. I know people who went to like their state schools who ended up finding really awesome research opportunities and doing really cool work there. And then, you know, as before, you can study outside of class. It's not like you're limited to only the classes you take. So that would be my advice. Just pursue everything you're interested in. Try to learn as much as you can, whether that's in class, outside of class, whatever. And then don't feel like you have to follow a very specific path in order to be successful at the things you want to do. A lot of different paths lead to the same places, and focusing on finding only one of them I think is sort of chasing the wrong thing.
We also got a question in the chat from Sebastian Adams, and he asked, what would you suggest in terms of internships during college for someone who wanted to get into a similar field? Are there any companies that offer them?
For sure, yeah. So I guess I can speak first to the internships that I did during college. So I worked my first summer at the Transportation Research Lab at the University of Michigan. I was doing radial basis function deformation. So what that means is you've got this wireframe model of a person, and I was developing some functions to morph it from a standing position into a seated position while doing sort of accurate deformations of the body. So that turns out to be not relevant to what I do now, but it helped me develop some critical thinking skills and some coding skills, things like that. My sophomore year, I interned at a robotics company in Pasadena called Miso Robotic. They're taking 6-axis industrial arms and they're putting them into quick serve restaurant kitchens. So like burger flipping, fries, that kind of thing. Again, not relevant to what I'm doing now. But again, provided some research in a company environment. Specifically, that was a really agile company. It was like 10 people, I think, working at the time to get the first version of this done and into a kitchen. So that was also something that was really interesting for me in terms of developing more experience. And the other two that I did were I worked at Jet Propulsion Laboratory for a summer working on a new methane sensor that's intended to measure methane concentrations in the deep oceans. That's more of an environmental science project, but again, some of the engineering experience. And working at JPL was extremely regimented. It was both kind of nice in that I always knew what was expected of me. Wasn't there any uncertainty about what my responsibilities were. But on the other hand, it took, for example, a long time to get permission to do things because it went up this very strict hierarchy and then came back down. And that just takes time to do things. So what I'd recommend really is find some companies that are doing work you're interested in, whether that's robotics, whether it's space, whether it's environmental science, anything like that. I'm speaking specifically for STEM and sort of aerospace oriented fields. And then find a couple of different companies that act in different ways. So if you wanted to go work on aircraft, maybe go and try and get an internship at Boeing or Airbus, and then a different year try and get an internship at some small, maybe aircraft parts manufacturer, so that you can get both the big corporate experience and the smaller sort of startup-y experience and figure out what you like. I didn't think that I would like the big corporate experience. Turns out I don't. But if I hadn't gone and gotten the internship at JPL, and it was a fantastic summer, I wouldn't have known that. And then I wouldn't have been able to make an informed decision. So there's partly find things that'll look good on a resume and partly find things that will help you make your decision, because that's just as important.
All right, thank you. And here's another question. What have been some challenges that you've had to overcome, and have you ever doubted yourself along the way?
Yes, absolutely. So my first term at CalTech, I'll use this example because it's sort of emblematic of my time at CalTech, frankly. Got it. Yeah, the screen sharing's off. I got to CalTech having done quite well at Greenhills, and I was sort of subconsciously expecting that CalTech would be kind of similar. I didn't really understand what it would take to be successful there. So I got there and I got my first math test back maybe after a month. And the score was at like 32% or something. I don't remember what the number was, but it was about a 32%. And the class average, to be fair, was about the same. But I remember sitting there thinking, what have I gotten myself into? is my entire CalTech experience going to be like this? Because I felt like I wasn't understanding the material super well, and it just wasn't it wasn't what I was, again, sort of expecting going into it. I didn't have a good idea of what I was in for. So that was definitely a really eye-opening experience of, you know, it's the story of like the big fish in a little pond. You find yourself in a big pond with lots of other big fish, right? So one of the things was trying to, well, not trying to, but it eventually coming to terms with the idea that just because you've been successful at one thing doesn't mean you'll be successful at other things. And just because you feel like you're not succeeding at something doesn't mean that everyone else doesn't feel that same way too. I talked to all my friends after that, and they were all in roughly the same, you know, boat, where everyone had done very, very poorly on this test, or so we thought. It turns out in retrospect, they do that intentionally. The first few exams are always made to be really difficult, and you're on pass-fail during that term. So it's not out of maliciousness, and it's not to do anything like that, but it's to shock everybody and sort of wake everybody up to the idea that, you know, it's not enough to have been good at things. You have to constantly work to stay on top of yourself and your responsibilities. So that was definitely one of the big lessons going from high school to college, which I would be surprised if everyone didn't feel that in at least some way. But definitely some personal doubt after seeing the first couple of assessments come back and realizing that were it not on pass fail, I would be getting D's in my classes.
Thank you. We have a couple questions regarding the parachute. Some people are
Mhm.
wondering what it means. They just want to know. So if you would mind telling them.
Yeah, for sure. Okay, so the parachute, let me go back to Curiosity for a moment. So Curiosity landed on Mars in 2012. I actually remember watching the landing. And Curiosity had these wheels that had holes in them, and the holes were nominally to drain out sand and rocks that got into it. But it turns out there was another reason, and the holes spelled JPL in Morse code. Jet Propulsion Laboratory manages Curiosity, Perseverance, and all the robotic exploring missions. And JPL had snuck this into the wheels, so it would print JPL on the surface of Mars over and over again as it drove. The story goes that NASA leadership was not very happy about this, and they forbade JPL from doing something like that again. And so they didn't. The wheels are totally normal this time, but the parachute is not. So as I mentioned earlier, there's a coded message in the parachute. And something that you'll see when you look at it is there are red sections and there are white sections. And looking at a parachute that's two different colors, and those are they seem sort of randomly distributed. The first thing that I would think if I looked at that was binary. And maybe there's some sort of encoding in binary in the pattern of the white and red sections on the parachute. So that's sort of the first clue that I would give you. And then the second clue that I would give you is if you're reading binary in a ring like that, so you've got this whole ring of binary sections, you have to start from somewhere. So there might be a reasonable or logical place to start reading on the parachute. I don't want to actually give away the answer because I think it'd be fun for people to take a look at it. Some of my friends and I took a look at it on Monday, spent a few hours figuring it out. And it was a really fun experience for us. So I don't want to spoil it for anybody who wants to figure it out on their own. If you want to see the parachute, you can look up. There are pictures of it on the internet, but be careful because a lot of them now have the message decoded in like an article alongside it.
Yeah, maybe you could send a picture in the chat or something, or a link. That'd be good.
Yeah, let me see if I can do that. I can certainly send a link. I don't know if I can send a picture over Zoom. But in any case, you can go to ask the next question and I will find a link. There should be a link, I think, to just the parachute. Unfortunately, it's a Google link, so it's really long. Okay.
If you want to ask another question.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, I could. So we have a question here in the chat. I don't know how much you can say about this, but Jenny is asking about the rocket that crushed its base when it was coming down, and if you were involved in that project and what you think went wrong there.
Yeah, so I think you're talking about serial number 8, the Starship that launched in December. I'm not involved in Starship, but I can say what went wrong with that one because it's been publicly released. So on Ascent, actually, I'm sorry. When they tried to relight the engines, the header tank, which is a tank that holds the propellant for landing, lost pressure. So as a result, there wasn't enough propellant going into the engine, and it was running oxygen rich. Oxygen rich just means there's more oxidizer than fuel, which, again, if you've taken chemistry, you know that you need oxygen, you need fuel, you need heat. So the engine is already running, but it's starved of fuel, which means you now just have a lot of hot oxygen gas. And hot oxygen gas is really, really bad for pretty much everything. So the engine started burning itself. You can see the green flame coming out of the bottom. If you rewatch the video of that landing, that's copper in the engine being combusted. And that's copper oxide in the flame coming out of the engine. That's all been released publicly. I can't say anything else about it.
Thank you. So we have a question from Tara Parks, and she asked, how did your experiences, internships, and jobs in the non-aerospace fields, as well as forensics and other high school and college experiences, help you in the interview process for SpaceX?
They helped me in that I already knew more or less how to interview. There was very little technical material in common between any of the other internships that I've done or interviews that I've done and the SpaceX interview. I don't think I can describe what the interview was, but the ability to think quickly about questions, to present work that I'd done in a way that was meaningful to the interviewer, those skills were really, really important. And I think in all the interviews I've done, they've been more important than the content of the interview itself. When I interviewed at Exonics, which is, I forgot to mention this one before, this is the internship that I did after my senior year at CalTech. They were interviewing for a mechanical engineer position, which I've been taking mechanical engineering classes, but a lot of the specific questions they asked, I didn't know the answer to immediately. Being able to reason through and answer to them was the most valuable thing I did in that interview. It was not the answers I gave, it was the process of getting to them. So in terms of practicing for interviews, I would say learning how to express your reasoning as you go through a problem is more important than learning any specific fact or any specific technique.
All right, great. And then this question here is from AJ, and he's asking, when did you first know you were interested in space?
Ooh, I remember watching the movie Apollo 13 with Tom Hanks in maybe around the time I moved to Michigan, so that would have been 2006. I would have been 7 or 8 years old. And about then, I knew I was interested in space. I got really back into it around my sophomore year of high school. So I guess that would have been 2012, 13. and really got into it in a way that I was intending to go into aerospace and just specifically the space industry. So about 10 years probably, I would say, is the timeline from when I actually started working towards going into space.
Great, awesome. So Zoe has a question. What do you think your industry will look like in 50 years, and what do you think is the future of space exploration?
That's an awesome question. I can speculate a little bit. I don't think that I have a solid answer for that. So speculating, I think that in 50 years, we will have certainly sent people to Mars. I don't know whether we'll be there permanently. I think we'll have a permanent settlement on the moon, and that there will be some sort of industry going on there, whether it's just scientific, primarily, or whether there's some sort of economic reason to do it. That I'm not sure of. I don't know of any currently compelling economic reason to go to the moon. I do know that there's a lot of scientific rationale for going to the moon. I also think we'll be doing a lot of very specialized work in low Earth orbit, like what the ISS does now. So the ISS has a lot of experiments going on in terms of growing semiconductors, fiber optics. There's a lot of medical research that goes on there because you can crystallize proteins very, very efficiently in space. Without gravity, you can get big monolithic crystals, which are really, really good for X-ray crystallography. So you can characterize these structures really, really well. That makes space a really attractive place to do drug research, for example, developing compounds that target specific active sites. It makes it a really attractive place to grow really any sort of crystal that's more efficient when it's monolithic. So like I mentioned semiconductors. Flaws in semiconductors cause inefficiencies in the products that are made from them. If you can grow a single crystal it's monocrystalline, then that's going to be substantially better for making semiconductor products, which are 95% at least of all electronics we use. Likewise, the fiber optics, if you can grow those without crystalline defects, then they lose less light traveling through them and they can carry more information. So fiber optic cables could become more efficient growing those in space. I think broad strokes, that's what space exploration is going to look like in 50 years.
All right. And then I'm going to try to combine a couple of questions that we had here.
Sure.
What is your favorite thing about working at SpaceX, and have you ever met Elon Musk?
My favorite thing about working at SpaceX is how much there is going on. So I work on Falcon, which is the rockets that are sort of in production and they're in service. So that launches Starlink, or anytime you see something that's like SpaceX launch and it's on a pad in Kennedy Space Center or Vandenberg, that's Falcon. So I know a lot about that program, but the company is very transparent internally. So I know a lot about the Starship program too, and a lot about Starlink, and a lot about some other projects that I can't talk about. It's been really, really cool to see everything that's going on and to stay informed on all the things that we haven't made public yet. So that's got to be my favorite thing about working with SpaceX, is being up to date on all the news. Followed very closely by working on rockets, because that's really cool, and actually writing some of these proposals that end up going out to customers and resulting in contracts. It's really humbling to go from being in school June of last year to this year, playing a major role in getting tens of millions of dollars in contracts. It's really exceptional and something I really enjoy about my job.
Awesome, thank you. So another question that we had down was, what is your take on intelligent extraterrestrial life?
This is a fun one. So I'm certain that at least some of you are familiar with the Drake equation. For anyone who's not, the Drake equation is a way of sort of guesstimating how many intelligent civilizations there might be. So you take the number of stars, the number that have planets, the number of planets that are in the habitable zone, the ones that developed microbial life, developed multicellular life, developed intelligent life. And so you've got this chain of multiplication going on. And there are a few more terms, but that's the gist of it. And the funny thing about the Drake equation is people wind up getting wildly different answers depending on their assumptions. So some people say that maybe 1 in 1,000 planets develops microbial life, and some people say that 1 in 1,000,000 develops microbial life, and that's 3 orders of magnitude right there. And the difference that makes in the result you get is so large that it's just incredible. The reason I bring that up is your opinion on extraterrestrial life is mostly dependent on what you think the constants in the Drake equation are. Or, if you were to think about it, how would you assign those constants? And the answer you come up with for whether there's extraterrestrial life is pretty much entirely dependent on what you think those values are. So it's a very personal answer. However, with that said, one of the things I've become really interested in is the idea of life as an entropy maximizing process. So if you look at the Earth's surface, it is in a very different redox state from the center of the planet. The center of the planet's almost entirely reduced. The surface is almost entirely oxidized. And that's just because we get the photosynthesis via plants, we get this very out of balance system. And so we have free oxygen in the atmosphere, for example. Free oxygen rusts everything. Any iron that comes to the surface of the planet becomes iron oxide. It just happens, right? Free oxygen is really, really corrosive. And it's a very powerful oxidizer, as anyone who's taken Mr. Rossi's class will know. Only fluorine and a few exotic compounds are really better than oxygen. So what the idea that's really interesting to me is through plate tectonics and through the action of the planet, we get really oxidized material subducted and really reduced material raised up and formed into the continental plates, right? The ocean, the oceanic crust, and it gets subducted and transferred back into the mantle. And so we have the planet trying to pull off this oxidation reduction reaction all the time. And one of the things I think is kind of cool is that life thermodynamically helps make that more efficient because it provides this really oxidized state for all the material that's subducted back into the mantle. So with that in mind, maybe the answer is that life is really, really common because the conditions for it are sort of thermodynamically favorable to develop life and then to have this redox reaction happening more efficiently. So from that perspective, it maybe makes sense to say there's a lot of life everywhere, wherever it can exist from a chemical standpoint, just because thermodynamically it helps bring the system into equilibrium. My personal view is that's probably pretty likely, and I think there is a lot of life out there, but that doesn't mean that it's intelligent. It doesn't mean it's multicellular. It could just be there's a lot of bacteria and a lot of archaea everywhere that we would happen to look, but maybe nothing that we could recognize as life. In terms of, you look around, you see insects outside, you see birds, right? You see people. That I'm much less certain of, but definitely in terms of biological systems, I think those are probably pretty common.
Alex, thank you very much. We are right about the end of our time. Really appreciate you taking this time. I thought what you presented to be very informative for people who are curious about, some of the things you're learning, but also very helpful in terms of helping our students imagine themselves 5-6 years down the line what they're doing. And I totally affirm your emphasis on working in teams. That's really important. That none of us by ourselves know everything. I really appreciate that. And we also there was one last question from Teresa Casey. It's about as a runner, are you planning on participating in a run for the hills? We're going to have a running sort of virtual running thing to launch the new track, which we wish you could see in person.
Exciting, yeah.
A new track that's completed, and you'll have to come and see it when you're back in town. But from all of us at Greenhills, we thank you for coming and spending this afternoon with us. We're excited about what you're doing. I sort of think of you from Greenhills to space industry and beyond. So we'll see where you go. So
thank you so much for inviting me to
Yes.
come and speak.
Thank you. Thanks so much, Alex. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
You want to maybe
Thank you.
quickly talk about, before people leave, what the actual solution is to the parachute?
Okay.
I
Okay.
didn't want to spoil it, right?
Here's the other thing that I can say. The message has to do with JPL.